How the lives of a Ukrainian refugee and a Charlotte man with a criminal history converged in a fatal stabbing. Welcome to Behind the Crime, where true crime meets real life. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Let's uncover the truth, one case at a time. Now let's see today's story. The night train hummed down the Blue Line tracks, its fluorescent lights bouncing off tired faces and empty seats. It was late, and Scaleybark station was one of those stops where riders kept to themselves, scrolling through their phones, headphones plugged in, eyes lowered. Among them was Iryna Zarutska, a young woman with long blonde hair tucked neatly under a cap from the pizzeria where she worked. She wore khaki pants, a dark shirt, and carried herself with quiet energy. At just 23, she had lived through war, fled her homeland, and was slowly stitching together a new life in Charlotte, North Carolina. On that night, she was just another passenger, another figure in the late-night anonymity of public transit. She sat in an empty row, phone in hand, her attention fixed on the glowing screen. Behind her, a man in a red sweatshirt slouched in his seat, restless, fidgeting. He would later be identified as Decarlos Brown, a 33-year-old with a long criminal record and a troubled mind tormented by hallucinations. For 4 minutes, they rode in silence, two lives orbiting in the same space, unaware of how violently their paths would collide. Then, without warning, Brown reached into his clothes and pulled out a knife. For a second, he hesitated, staring out the window as if lost in thought. But in a sudden surge, he leaned forward, swung his arm over the seat, and drove the blade into Iryna. She clutched her throat and face, collapsing to the ground as passengers gasped, then scrambled to help. The train did not stop. The night did not pause. Within minutes, Iryna lay lifeless on the floor. It was a brutal convergence. A young woman who had escaped violence in Ukraine only to find it on the streets of America, and a man whose untreated illness and fractured life had left him capable of horror. The tragedy was caught on video, later shared widely across social media, transforming a moment of chaos into a symbol. For some, it was proof of rising urban crime. For others, a failure of the justice and healthcare systems that had repeatedly released a man clearly in crisis. And for Iryna's family, it was unbearable confirmation that the safety they sought in America had been a fragile illusion. Long before the Blue Line and the flickering lights of Charlotte, there was Kiev, a city that shaped Iryna Zarutska's imagination. Born in 2001, she was the middle child in a close-knit family. Her mother, her sister, and her younger brother. From a young age, she carried what her mother called an artist's gift. It wasn't just that she could draw or sculpt with unusual grace. It was that she seemed to see beauty where others missed it. She attended Synergy College, a small institution where she earned a degree in art and restoration. Her friends remembered her as someone who could spend hours hunched over a canvas or carefully repairing a chipped ceramic piece. She loved to give her creations away, as if her art only truly lived when it belonged to someone else. But while Iryna was creating, Ukraine was unraveling. In February 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion turned ordinary life into a daily lottery of survival. Sirens cut through nights, bombs cratered neighborhoods, and entire families packed bags they might never return to unpack. For Iryna, who lived through the relentless shelling of Kiev, every morning carried the haunting question: would this be the last one? 6 months into the war, she and her family made the impossible decision. They would leave. It was the agony of not knowing if you're going to live or breathe another day, said Lonnie, a family friend who later spoke to local reporters. With her mother, her sister, and her brother, Iryna fled westward and eventually found passage to the United States, where North Carolina offered a quieter refuge. In Charlotte, life was both foreign and comforting. She enrolled at Rowan Cabarrus Community College, hoping to become a veterinary assistant. Animals had always tugged at her heart. Neighbors often spotted her walking their dogs, smiling even when weighed down by homesickness. She picked up work at Zappetti's Pizzeria, a lively spot in South End, surrounded by breweries, coffee shops, and the hum of young professionals. Her obituary, written with both grief and love, described her as a homebody happiest when close to family. But she was also building independence, learning to drive, taking the train, inching toward a life of her own. Charlotte seemed to embrace her back. The city's skyline glimmered with possibility, its light rail system pulsing with energy. On weekends, she sketched in notebooks, walked through parks, and talked about how different her future might look now. For Iryna, America was meant to be a place where she could grow roots without fear of bombs overhead. She had escaped one kind of violence, not knowing another waited in the shadows of her new home. While Iryna was sketching birds in the margins of her notebooks in Kiev, Decarlos Brown was pacing the cracked sidewalks of Charlotte. He had grown up in the same city that later welcomed her. But for him, home was less a refuge and more a battleground. Born in 1992, Decarlos was the son of a mother who loved him fiercely, and a father largely absent from the day-to-day grind of raising a child. His mother, Michelle DeWitt, often juggled long hours and stretched paychecks, trying to keep her children clothed, fed, and above all, safe. But from early on, she noticed something different about her son. He was bright, even charming at times, but also restless, unable to sit still, prone to sudden storms of anger that seemed to come from nowhere. Teachers wrote him off as a troublemaker. By his teens, he had started running with kids who skipped school, smoking weed, shoplifting, pushing boundaries. Charlotte, like any city, offered both opportunity and temptation. Decarlos leaned into the latter. His first arrests were small-time larceny, breaking and entering, but the pattern grew. By his early 20s, he was convicted of armed robbery, a crime that landed him behind bars for more than 5 years. Prison was supposed to be a turning point, but instead it deepened his fractures. Inside, he began showing signs of serious mental illness, hallucinations, paranoia, whispers of voices no one else could hear. When he came out in 2020, his sister Tracy Brown said she barely recognized him. Conversations that once flowed now sputtered into fragments. He couldn't hold down jobs. He drifted between shelters, friends' couches, and his mother's house, where he sometimes turned violent. Michelle loved her son, but love was no match for the outbursts. She had kicked him out before, praying he would find help elsewhere. When he returned days before the stabbing, asking for a place to sleep, she let him in for the night. The next morning, she drove him to a shelter, hugged him, and told him she loved him. It was the last moment of peace before the storm. Tracy remembered the times he confided in her about the government implanting a chip in his body, controlling when he ate, walked, or spoke. He called 911 once, demanding officers investigate the man-made material inside him. When police told him it was a medical matter, not a criminal one, he grew angry and frightened. He dialed 911 again. This time, they charged him with misuse of the emergency line. He walked free with a promise to return for his next court date. Another missed chance for intervention. He wasn't himself, Tracy said later. He was battling something none of us could fix. She carried the scars, literal ones, from his breakdowns. In 2022, he attacked her, biting her and breaking a door off its hinges. She didn't press charges, fearing that prison would only worsen his unraveling. Instead, she prayed, begged, tried to get him into long-term care. But without guardianship, her mother's attempts to commit him failed. So Decarlos drifted, a man lost in his own mind, sometimes lucid, sometimes terrified, sometimes dangerous. His family loved him, but they lived in fear of him, too. On the night he boarded the train, his hood pulled low over his face, he rocked back and forth, nodding, muttering, fidgeting with nervous energy. Video later revealed the signs of a mind at war with itself. Sudden jolts upright, then slumping forward, restless swaying, then long vacant stares. To those watching, he was just another troubled soul on public transit. To Iryna, he was simply the man in the row behind her. Neither knew how little time was left. The Blue Line train rattled south through Charlotte, fluorescent lights reflecting against glass. Most passengers sat in silence, scattered across rows, immersed in phones, earbuds, or their own thoughts. Iryna had just boarded, sliding into an empty seat. She leaned forward, her phone resting in her hands, her long hair tucked neatly under her pizzeria cap. It was late, but not unusually so. For her, the train was routine, a bridge between work and home, between effort and rest. Just behind her sat Decarlos, restless under his red sweatshirt. Surveillance footage later revealed his unease. The shifting of weight, the nodding and shaking of his head, the fidgeting hands. For minutes, nothing happened. Just the low hum of a city train carrying strangers home. Then, in an instant, it changed. Passengers nearby heard a sudden movement, a quick intake of breath, then saw Iryna collapse forward, clutching her face and throat. Panic rippled through the car as screams erupted. People rushed to her side, kneeling, trying to help as best they could with what little they had. But the effort was futile. Within minutes, Iryna's life slipped away. Others looked toward the man in the red sweatshirt. He sat rigid, his hood pulled forward, still gripped by the world inside his mind. Later, his sister would say he believed the young woman had been reading his thoughts. The train continued moving, lights still flickering, steel wheels grinding along the track. What began as an ordinary ride had ended in a scene of chaos and despair. For Iryna, the promise of a life she was building in Charlotte ended abruptly on that floor. For Decarlos, the shadows that had haunted him for years had finally broken into violence. For the passengers who witnessed it, the night became unforgettable, a moment where safety dissolved in seconds. The collision was complete. Two lives, shaped by vastly different worlds, intersecting in tragedy neither could have foreseen. In the hours after the stabbing, the story spread quickly. A young woman killed in a seemingly random attack on Charlotte's light rail. Local news outlets ran grainy stills from the surveillance video, reporters speaking in somber tones about the suspect's long criminal record. But within days, the narrative had grown far beyond Charlotte. At the center stood two lives: Iryna Zarutska, a Ukrainian refugee who had fled a war only to be killed in the country she thought would save her. Decarlos Brown, a man with a history of violent crime, untreated schizophrenia, and a cycle of arrests and releases that left him adrift. For many, the story symbolized failure of the courts, of the mental health system, of the safety nets meant to prevent tragedy. When video of the attack surfaced online, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Politicians seized on it as proof of larger narratives. Former President Donald Trump, then deep in a campaign built on law and order, pointed to Brown as the archetype of the career criminal let loose in a city run by Democrats. North Carolina and every state needs law and order, he wrote on Truth Social. Only Republicans will deliver it. Within the administration, the case was invoked as justification for deploying federal forces to major cities. Charlotte became a rhetorical battleground alongside Los Angeles, Washington, and Chicago. Urban landscapes cast as dangerous because of leniency, incompetence, or both. To Trump and his allies, Iryna's death was a rallying cry, an example of what they called unchecked urban crime. To Charlotte's leaders, it was more complicated. Mayor Vilyles called the killing devastating, but resisted the narrative that her city was lawless. Instead, she pointed to systemic breakdowns. Brown, she argued, had been repeatedly flagged for mental health concerns, yet had never received the long-term care he needed. Courts cycled him in and out. Police arrested him for misusing 911 when he begged them to investigate voices in his head, but released him with a promise to return to court. "This is not just about crime," she said. "It's about a system that failed to treat mental illness before it became violence." Brown's family echoed her words. His mother and sister, both racked with shame and grief, spoke openly about his schizophrenia. They had tried to intervene, tried to secure him a place in a treatment facility, but bureaucratic walls and legal limits kept them powerless. "He was battling something none of US could fix," Tracy Brown said, "and the system didn't step in either." The killing forced uncomfortable questions into public view. Why was a man with schizophrenia, hallucinations, and a record of violence repeatedly released back into the community? Why had his family's pleas for long-term care gone unanswered? Was this a failure of mental health policy, or of a justice system too lenient on repeat offenders? For some, it was proof of what happens when jails substitute for hospitals. For others, it was a reminder that public safety required stricter enforcement, not softer approaches. The debate polarized quickly. In Washington, Republicans amplified the case as an emblem of Democratic mismanagement. In Charlotte, city leaders insisted the real crisis was an underfunded, fractured mental health system. And in the middle lay the families, one grieving the loss of a daughter, the other wrestling with the shame of a son they loved but feared. By the time a federal charge was filed against Brown, the crime had grown larger than itself. It was no longer just about what happened on a train at Scaleybark station. It was about who America chooses to protect and how. For Iryna's family, it was a cruel irony. They had left Ukraine to escape the randomness of violence, only to face it again in a country they thought would offer safety. For Brown's family, it was confirmation of years of fear. That untreated illness, ignored for too long, could one day end in disaster. And for the nation, it became another entry in the ongoing argument about crime, justice, and care. A tragedy folded into politics, stripped down to a symbol, even as the human stories remained painfully raw. The murder of Iryna Zarutska was not just the story of one young woman's death, nor even the story of a man broken by untreated schizophrenia. It was the story of systems in collapse, a justice system too overburdened to weigh risk carefully, a mental health system too fragmented to intervene meaningfully, and a political environment too eager to weaponize tragedy instead of fixing its roots. Decarlos Brown's descent was neither sudden nor unpredictable. His family saw it unfold. Paranoia, hallucinations, violence that frightened even those who loved him most. His sister tried to secure long-term treatment. His mother pleaded for facilities to take him. Both were told versions of the same answer. Without guardianship, without criminal conviction, without the right box checked, he could not be forced into the care he so clearly needed. This bureaucratic paralysis is not unique to Charlotte. Across the United States, thousands of families beg for help only to be told the system cannot act until someone becomes dangerous. By then, it is too late for the person in crisis, and too late for the victims caught in the crossfire. Brown's 911 calls, in which he insisted the government had implanted a chip controlling his movements, should have been a red flag demanding medical intervention. Instead, they became a misdemeanor charge and a written promise to appear in court. Paperwork substituted for treatment, and a man teetering on the edge was set free. The courts did what they often do with defendants like Brown: process, release, repeat. His long criminal history armed robbery, larceny, breaking and entering, painted the picture of a career criminal. But his behavior also screamed of untreated illness. The justice system treated him as both and as neither. This gap between punishment and treatment is where public safety unravels. Judges can jail, but not cure. Jails themselves have become de facto psychiatric facilities, but with neither the resources nor the mandate to treat. Release becomes the default, even when it puts the public at risk. It was inevitable that Iryna's death would be seized by politicians. The footage was visceral, the story stark. A refugee fleeing bombs abroad, killed by a man long known to the courts at home. For Donald Trump, it was a perfect talking point. Law and order became the rallying cry, with Brown cast as the embodiment of democratic failure. But framing the killing as proof of urban crime obscured its deeper reality. This was not about gangs or drugs or policing levels. It was about the absence of a coherent, functioning system for people like Brown, those too sick to live independently, but not supported enough to survive safely in the community. The tragedy lies in the dual failure. The failure to protect Iryna, who came to America for safety, but found none. The failure to treat Decarlos, whose illness was left to fester until it turned violent. These were not isolated failures. They were systemic, predictable, repeated across cities and states. And until those systems change, until mental health is funded with the seriousness of policing, until courts are given real options beyond release or incarceration, the cycle will continue. What remains are the shattered families. A Ukrainian mother burying her daughter on foreign soil, and an American mother watching her son charged with murder. Both families grieve. Both blame the structures that were supposed to protect them, and both know nothing can undo what happened on that train. What also remains is a question the country must confront. How many more collisions like this will it take before reform is more than a campaign slogan? The Scaleybark station stabbing was not random. It was inevitable, born of neglect, silence, and delay. A war refugee and a man at war with his own mind crossed paths. And the cost was a life that should never have been lost. If the United States cannot learn from Iryna and Decarlos, cannot see in their stories both the need for compassion and the urgency of accountability, then the system will fail again, and the next train in the next city will carry another tragedy waiting to happen. Thank you for staying through to the Yendi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel now, and also feel free to comment and make a suggestion about anything or any story of your interest.